What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to another episode of AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. Larry Rifkin along with John Krofsik, and thank you for coming along for the ride. And we've got an exciting ride today. We're going to be talking about something that people love. They love gold, John.
Gold. Yes, gold.
Well, look, I mean, gold is the reason we discovered America in many ways.
True.
The gold
That's
rush,
true.
right?
Yeah, that's true.
And, of course, I don't see any gold around your finger, John. What's going on there?
I lost my
Your
ring.
wife?
Yeah. No, I lost my ring.
Oh, okay. That's better than losing your wife.
Playing football. Actually, I was playing that evil sport football, and I lost my
See,
ring.
it does you. There's justice. You shouldn't be playing football. Well, no, maybe flag or touch football. That's what it had to be, right?
Yeah, we were just playing with the kids.
Oh, that's fine.
When my kids were little.
Okay.
We were playing out there
Not
in the
tackle.
backyard. Well, it was sort of like touch tackle kind of thing, you know.
Okay.
Because I could just pick them up and run with them.
Well, we're not talking about football today. We've talked about that. We have a podcast up about that. We are talking about gold and its relationship to the American currency over history. It's really a fascinating story. And there is a gentleman, James Ledbetter, who says that many of the nation's worst economic catastrophes happened while we were on the gold standard. Now, a lot of people think that the gold standard is the answer to stability with our monetary supply.
Guess it does put kind of, you can only spend as much as you have. So I can see it in one way it'd be good because these politicians just spend whatever they want because they can crank it out.
But think about Herbert Hoover and think about the fact that that was not something that helped us during the Depression.
No, that's true.
And it kind of limited some of the options that he had. And FDR felt free to move around it. But it wasn't until the great Richard M. Nixon decided that we should not be on the gold standard whatsoever. A lot of people may be shocked to hear that. They might think, when did we go off the gold standard? Or they might think, because there's a new conversation about it, that we never did go off the gold standard. But we did.
We did. Well, I remember there was rumors at the time that Russia was going to flood the market with gold and it was going to devalue it. And there was all sorts of rumors going on at that time.
No, they just flood it with Facebook ads and try to upend the political system.
Those Russians are always
Those Russians. They always have to be into something a little underhanded. Well, One Nation Under Gold explores America's obsession with this precious metal. And I learned that over our history, we used a lot of different things. We used a lot of different currencies. We didn't standardize things. It's a really interesting history that James Ledbetter gets into. We talked to him more, John, about what's going on today and how much this gold standard idea should be reintroduced into the public dialogue. And do you know why it was reintroduced into the public dialogue?
I don't know why.
Well, because Donald J. Trump.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, during the 2016 campaign. You heard him say that, right?
Yes. Yep.
At one point, now again, it wasn't something that he was devoted to
they
doing.
want to get rid of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
That's
well,
big,
yeah.
and then go back to the gold standard.
Right. But, I mean, it wasn't the way that he talked with such fervor about the wall.
No.
But he did throw out the notion that maybe we should return to the gold standard. But I don't know that that is something that he's even picked up on since.
No, I think he's too busy with other things. He's still having trouble with the wall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think we're going to go back to different forms of currency. I don't think we're going to go back to barter. I don't think some of these things are really coming into view. As much as we wonder about whether we have polluted the money supply and overinflated it. I mean, don't forget that after the Great Recession, I mean, whether people think he was right or wrong, Barack Obama took a totally different approach to what we should do from what Herbert Hoover did. Herbert Hoover said, let's become more austere. And what Barack Obama said is, let's over and hyperinflate and let it roll. Yeah. And now we're beginning to kind of pull back on that, the Federal Reserve. And people are wondering, well, how fast should we pull back? But it did help us to avert.
It did, but I think we're already starting to see, though, reflecting the inflation. I think, if you look at Costco, prices from last year even to this year on a lot of stuff has gone up.
You've really noticed that?
Yeah, I have, on stuff that we've bought. So I think inflation is really starting to set in.
Well, there's a danger being too austere. There's a danger in being too stimulative of the economy. And that's something that we do talk to James Ledbetter about in this interview. And you will, after this, be in a much better position if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, don't you think what's going on at Fort Knox is something we should be a lot more concerned about? I know that our Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Mnuchin, made one of the first trips to Fort Knox in a very long time. Most of our public officials don't even care about the gold that is there.
Right, and there was rumors that it was missing.
Yeah, absolutely. But they say he went for a cursory tour and may not have gotten all the answers.
He didn't count them.
He didn't sit there and count it himself. He's got a lot of his own money to count. But why don't we do this? Why don't we talk to James Ledbetter? And again, the book that he's written is called One Nation Under Gold. And I really think it's important to understand where we've been, what the gold standard has allowed or limited, and now this kind of freewheeling currency that we have underpinned by the faith and confidence in the U.S. government. Is that enough today, or have so many people lost faith in America that, in fact, that will be a dwindling thing to rely on in terms of our currency?
Well, fortunately, I guess for us there's been no other currency that they're floundering. Everybody's floundering, so that's kind of kept us in the forefront still.
Yeah, I guess in the land of the Lilliputians, America looks pretty good. But is that enough to give you confidence? Because there are many people, and some of them are taking great advantage of our nervousness and anxiety over the economy. And they're on television telling you all the time that you've got to go back and you've got to have gold as part of your portfolio.
That TV will rot your brain. Radio is far superior.
Well, yeah, though it's been co-opted by a couple of marauders over the years. But when you look at television and you see those ads, I mean, you think that you should bar the door, get all the gold you can, put it in your basement. Right. Is that the right philosophy?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Well, James Ledbetter is going to give us a really nuanced look at One Nation Under Gold. James Ledbetter is with us. He is the author of One Nation Under Gold, How One Precious Metal Has Dominated the American Imagination for 4 Centuries. And, James, I was just reading where our Treasury Secretary, Mr. Mnuchin, made one of the first visits that a Secretary of the Treasury has made in a long time to Fort Knox. And, of course, as an old movie producer, he said, I assume the gold is still there. It would be really quite a movie if we walked in and there was no gold. And yet, do we really have a good accounting of what is there at Fort Knox?
Well, no one outside of Treasury has been inside of Fort Knox since the mid-1970s. A group of congressmen, some of whom were skeptical about the contents of Fort Knox, were allowed in as part of a post-Watergate transparency exercise. And they certainly confirmed that they saw a bunch of gold. Now, if you really want to go down the conspiracy theory lane, there are people who will point out that they only visited one room and that who knows if the other rooms were empty, or that maybe, no one weighed the gold to see if it was really maybe not just wooden bars painted with gold paint. I mean, people who are motivated to doubt things are going to be motivated no matter, what kind of evidence they're presented with. We believe the United States government is in possession of approximately $11 billion worth of gold. That's valued at a statutory rate of $42 an ounce, which is, of course, not what it would be worth on the open market. The bulk of that gold is in Fort Knox and in West Point. There is a large deposit of gold not far from where I'm standing right now in Lower Manhattan, in the basement of the New York Federal Reserve. But most of that gold actually belongs to countries outside the United States. There have been various conspiracy theories over the decades to suggest that not all of the gold is there. One of the difficulties with that type of theory is if it's not there, where is it? You can't. One of the interesting properties of gold is you can't actually destroy it. It can be melted down. It can take different forms, but you can't get rid of it. And so it would have to show up somewhere else. And so if there is a conspiracy to cover up the gold, there would be a very huge question of where that gold ends
Oh,
up.
absolutely. But the Wall Street Journal, they did a piece. So I talked about Mr. Mnuchin, 80 feet below the streets of Lower Manhattan. The Federal Reserve Vault, protected by armed guards, contains about 6,200 tons of gold, or doesn't. So everybody is throwing this out today. Is there a new, renewed fascination with gold?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it never really went away. I mean, one of the points of my book, One Nation Under Gold, is that it's woven into the DNA of the American mind. To mix a couple of metaphors there, and if you think about the North American landmass, it was discovered by Europeans who were trying to find a passage to India, thought they were on their way to India. And why did they want to go to India? Well, they thought there would be gold here. I think a lot of them were sort of disappointed when it didn't show up, but not long after the country, became a proper country, gold was discovered in North Carolina in 1799. So it really goes back to almost the very beginning of our nation. And I think that particularly in times of economic anxiety, which these days seems to be pretty much all the time, there is a renewed fascination with gold. But I read that Wall Street Journal piece, and I frankly didn't think all that much of it. It didn't seem to offer much fuel for any rational reason to doubt the gold reserves. Could it be more transparently audited? Absolutely. One of the points that I make in the book is that particularly in the post-war era, in the 50s and 60s, there was a panic about the nation's gold supply. We had amassed the largest gold supply in the history of mankind, but because it was propping up the dollar and frankly the world monetary system, there was this fear that we might run out of the stuff. So the dollar was fully convertible to gold during that period at the rate of $35 an ounce. Mm-hmm. In theory, anybody with $35 could go to the United States Treasury and get an ounce of gold, and anybody with an ounce of gold could go to the United States Treasury and get $35. And the system worked very well. It arguably worked too well in the sense that the growth of Western Europe and Japan created a situation where you had all of these dollars and dollar-denominated securities out in the world, and if they were to all be redeemed for gold, we would run out. And so there was a rationale for secrecy around gold supplies because in theory, if we ran out of gold, the entire global economy would have collapsed. Now, I don't think that that's true today. And so the rationale for secrecy is not necessarily there, but the secrecy has a way of sticking around, and just like the gold itself.
Well, I think that's one incontrovertible part of your book, which is we were on the gold standard during the worst downturn in American economic history, the Great Depression. So what was it that the gold standard was meant to uphold in terms of our stability economically?
Yeah. So the idea of a single gold standard really begins to take hold at the latter part of the 19th century. Prior to that, the United States had systems whereby both gold and silver were legal tender. It was the so-called bimetallic standard. The ratio of gold to silver in terms of their value in the market changed according to different pieces of legislation, and then you get the rise of a populist movement in the late part of the 19th century that wants to restore silver as a medium. That's the origin.
Yeah, William Jennings
Bryan's famous speech: "You will not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He was trying to restore a silver standard because the states in the West and in the South, where silver was quite plentiful, thought that they had been given a raw deal. And the modern push for a single gold standard is to some degree in reaction to that. And we remained on some version of the gold standard through most of the 20th century. FDR is one of the things that he did when he first took office was to pass legislation that allowed for two things. One, the closing of every bank in the United States, and two, the confiscation of all privately held gold in any substantial amount. Now, the banks were reopened, or at least the healthy banks were reopened, within a matter of days or weeks, but the prohibition against owning gold stuck around for some 40 years. And then, of course, after World War II, we went on the Bretton Woods standard that I just mentioned, the $35 an ounce. So it has been part of the country's monetary history for a very long period. But as you point out, that period also includes some of the greatest financial disasters in the nation's history, including the panics of 1873, the 1890s, and the 1930s. So whatever value a gold-based currency was bringing to the table, it was not enough to prevent these sort of terrible, protracted economic crises. And so one of my arguments is, well, then what good is it? Given all the other impracticalities associated with it, it doesn't. Not to say that our current monetary system is perfect. It certainly isn't. But it is quite practical.
Well, explain to us what our current monetary system is based on, if in fact we thought having these precious metals to underpin it was for a long period of time a good idea. What are we doing today?
Sure. Since 1971, the United States has been what is known as a floating currency, which is to say its value changes every day. It's not fixed to any particular chunk of metal. It's not fixed to any particular exchange rate, but rather the value of it is sort of what the world thinks it's worth at any given moment. The dollar trades against the euro, against the yen, against any number of currencies out there, and the market, of course, looks at a number of inputs in order to determine what that value is. It looks at things like the level of government spending, the overall health of the American economy, the size of American GDP, and one of the advantages that most economists think that this system has is that, one, it tends to ease whatever inflationary or deflationary pressures might be out there in the system by allowing movement on a day-to-day basis, so you don't have these dramatic revaluations of currency that used to take place in the old days, where suddenly you wake up one day and the pound would be worth 20% less than it was the day before. Those are tremendous shocks, and having this kind of market-based system is meant to eliminate those shocks. But the second advantage is that it allows for the government and the Federal Reserve to create liquidity when things go bad. So the view that most mainstream economists hold about the Great Depression is that the central bank and the Hoover administration were largely powerless to do anything about the Great Depression when it first hit because of the existence of the gold standard. You had a situation where a lot of the gold was leaving the country, particularly going to France, and you had a situation where the government couldn't really add anything to the economy because there was only so much gold that was there. There was only so much money that could be printed, and that was one of the rationales for taking the U.S. temporarily off the gold standard.
So if we look at what Barack Obama did in response to what he found when he came into office, the Great Recession, explain that difference.
Yeah, so what the Fed did, known as quantitative easing, essentially the creation billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of security, backed by nothing. Some people think that that's a terrible thing, that it's intrinsically inflationary, et cetera, but it does create some value that is meant to revive the economy by priming the pump. And that you can't really do that with a gold standard. Now again, you will find people who would argue that that's a good thing about the gold standard because they don't want that kind of value created. But again, the mainstream economic view is that this type of action by central banks is really necessary in order to get the economy out of the doldrums, which is hard enough with the tools that we have. But if you take those tools away by returning to a gold standard, it would arguably make the situation a lot worse. And I will say that while I think a return to the gold standard is wildly impractical and very, very, very unlikely, nonetheless, the presidential platform of the Republican Party in both 2012 and 2016 contained language that said we should study the idea of returning the United States dollar to some kind of metallic standard. They didn't say gold specifically, but that was clearly what was intended. And that was the first time in 50 years that showed up in a national party platform. So clearly there is a political movement of debatable size and impact, but nonetheless a political movement to restore the United States to a gold standard, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book.
Explain to the audience and to me, if in fact during the time of the dot-com boom back in the 90s, when the economy really began to grow because of this new technology, what would a gold standard economy have had to have done at that point in order to balance the value of the currency? What would it have had to done to expand in that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know that having a dollar denominated to gold would have had much impact one way or the other on that kind of boom. Part of the answer, Larry, depends on exactly what we mean by having a gold standard. There are different interpretations of that phrase, different ways to implement it. I think in a really, really strict sense of having money that is actually physically made out of gold be the only medium of exchange, and that is, when people like Ron Paul talk about a gold standard, that's what they're talking about.
Okay, so that's what he's talking about. We're all walking around with our own level of bullion on us?
Right, which is ludicrous. I mean, on its face, it's ludicrous. But okay. But under those circumstances, I would argue it's certainly a lot harder to have a kind of dynamic economic growth simply because it's so inefficient to move these quantities of money from place A to place B. They're heavy. They need to be guarded. All of these precautions that you don't have to do when you're dealing with paper currency or frankly electronic transactions. Now that's an extreme version. You could envision a version of the gold standard like we had in my childhood in the 1970s, where you had the 60s really, where you had the value of the dollar tied to gold. I don't know that system would have made much difference one way or another, but in general, I would say having a metallic basis for your money is a hindrance to economic growth, but mostly because of those inefficiencies.
You talk about the impracticalities. Of course, carrying around a precious metal is ludicrous on its face, given where we are today, where people are walking around with no money. And
right.
We'll talk about cryptocurrency in relation to still talking about a gold standard. But what was it that drew Richard Nixon to the idea of getting us off the gold standard?
Right. So I mentioned before this panic really that starts to seep in at the end of the Eisenhower administration and continues through the 1960s. The people at the very top, the president, top economic advisors, the head of the Federal Reserve, were all very, very aware and very scared of this idea of a balance of payments crisis that is basically running out of gold, having too many dollars and dollar-backed securities out in the world that could theoretically be cashed in for gold. And there's kind of no obvious solution without either changing the rules or putting the brakes on growth, because it's a paradox that's just built into that system. Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson all at times considered taking the United States off the gold standard, or somehow, radically re-envisioning the Bretton Woods system, but they mostly thought, frankly, that it would be a disaster. They called it the nuclear option in the Johnson White House, because it was so extreme. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, I mean, it was going to happen sooner or later. The system that was set up was simply not sustainable, because there would never be enough gold in order to sort of back up all the money that was out there. The triggers under Nixon in the first Nixon term had largely to do with speculation on the dollar. So you get basically throughout 1970 and 1971 all of these currency transactions where people are betting against the dollar, and huge amounts of money moving around and weakening the dollar to a point where it was really going to have an economic impact. It was having an economic impact, and I think that Nixon was not particularly concerned about the policy aspects of it. Nixon was concerned about getting reelected in 1972. We look at that election.
Yeah, but we
today,
think, he won 49
well, that's the
states.
thing. You look at the election today and realize how lopsided it was. It's hard to remember, but in the spring and summer of 1971, they thought they were behind. They thought this is how Watergate came about. I mean, they really thought that they were going to lose to Ed Muskie or
Ted Kennedy.
Some other Democrat, and so one of the things that the Nixon White House looked at, and this is particularly the work of his Treasury Secretary John Connally, who had been a Democrat, a Texas Democrat, was that if you took the United States off the gold standard, it would provide a boost that could be worth, maybe half a percentage point in the unemployment rate. Well, that's quite a lot of jobs, and that could really make the difference. And so they kind of pulled this thing together in a matter of weeks, really, and sprung it on the public in a way that was very subtle and very political. It was a Sunday night in August, interrupting Bonanza, the TV show, and Nixon framed it all in very patriotic terms, and the stock market reacted pretty well the next day when it opened, but the impact was pretty profound. I mean, if you think of the inflation and unemployment of the late 1970s and the oil shocks, all of that were sort of ripple effects from the action of taking us off the gold standard. But it was going to have to happen one way or another. It's almost an accident of history that it ended up being Nixon as opposed to Johnson. Certainly, the people around Johnson talked about it, but they never really got around to implementing it, in part because of the Vietnam War and all the other problems that Johnson had with his relationship to Congress.
It is remarkable, as you say, that Richard Nixon, who was pretty thoughtful about policy, that this really wasn't as much a concern to him as was the politics of this.
Yeah, well, that's Nixon, right? I mean, he was not, the kind of finer points of international finance was not a specialty of his.
Well, it's interesting. Now, how much is that related to foreign relations? Because we do think of him as being pretty schooled in terms of diplomacy and foreign relations, and this would have an impact, given the strength of the American economy, on the entire world.
It's true, but I do think that Nixon and Kissinger were more focused on diplomatic efforts, and of course fighting in Vietnam than they were on the international economy. I mean, you did have in the orbit Paul Volcker, the later the chair of the Federal Reserve, and John Connally, who were very focused on these issues for a time. But it was really and all of the tapes that you can listen to and the diaries of Haldeman make it pretty clear that it was a purely political decision on Nixon's part. And as I say, I mean, I think that the gold standard makes a lot less sense than the system that we have now. So although don't generally consider myself a fan of Richard Nixon, I do think that he managed to do something that his predecessors saw as a very viable path but couldn't pull off. So
now here we are 50 years on from this, and perhaps Donald Trump, being the first major party candidate in more than half a century to advocate returning to the gold standard, is that another reaction to the fact that, we've got money that's built out of thin air and we have so much debt and so forth? Is this what he's responding to when viscerally he says, well, maybe that would be a good thing to do?
It's a very good question, and far be it from me to explain what goes on inside the mind of Donald Trump or why. But you're quite right. I mean, he did take this position during the 2016 campaign. I wouldn't say it was a high priority for him. I mean, he was responding to a question that he was asked, but he did take a position different from that of Mitt Romney, and so that is a distinctive thing. To be honest, Trump seems to have difficulty even getting his executive orders carried out. I don't think that he is in a position to take on something as momentous as a change in the monetary standard. And I don't think that, despite the fact that it does have an appeal with certain voters within the Republican Party, I don't think that there is really a lot of political will in Congress to pull this off either. I mean, just to think about the impracticalities of it. I talked before about the dollar having been convertible to gold at $35 an ounce in the Bretton Woods system. Well, if we were going to convert to the gold standard tomorrow, what would the price be?
Yeah,
would it be $35 an ounce? No.
But you said it was only 42 now. Of course, we're not on the gold standard.
Well, on a statutory basis,
right.
That's what the government has to value its gold at.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone knows that on the open market, it's worth considerably more than that, by orders of magnitude more. But so would that be the price of gold? If we did it tomorrow, we take the market price of gold and make that the rate at which the dollar is convertible? Would you take an average over the last 3 years or 5 years or 10 years? Could you take the GDP of the United States and divide it by all the gold we hold and come up with a value that way? And depending on which method you choose, you get massively different prices, all of which reflect, a great reward to some group of people and a great, punishment to other groups of people. And if you get the price, quote, wrong, unquote, whatever that means, the chances are very good that you set up a situation where we would once again be under threat of losing our gold supply, right? Because we live in a global economy. Somewhere, someone is going to figure out that if we price gold at the dollar at X dollars per ounce, they will be able to sell it by X minus a couple of dollars, and you're powerless to keep them from buying the gold because now you're saying that the gold is backing up the dollar. So it is wildly impractical to do this in one country, and you could in theory do it as part of a global agreement, but there's no global appetite for a return to this. I mean,
does anyone still base their currency on anything like a precious metal such as gold?
No, I believe Switzerland was the last currency to move to a floating currency sometime in the 1980s or 90s. And the Swiss economy is, pretty small on a global basis. No, it has not been a front burner issue in any of the world's major economies for a long time. Now there are people who will tell you that China, which is now the world's largest gold producer, by the way, has been stockpiling gold, in a kind of covert way of backing up its currency, or perhaps preparing for some future breakdown of the monetary system that we have today. And that's not crazy. No monetary system lasts forever. There's no reason to think that the system that the world uses now will necessarily be around 100 years from now. And it's not an unreasonable bet to say that gold would play some role in that future system. But when it's going to happen or what role gold is going to play are critical questions, and no one really has the answer.
Well, James, a lot of people who are listening to this, they see the ads on television about gold and the way you need to convert or at least have a portion of your portfolio in it. What do you say? I mean, help us along when we see those ads. They seem rather compelling.
Sure. So I should make it clear that I'm not a financial advisor. My book is not a book about how to invest in gold. It's a history. Having said that, I think as you said, there are plenty of people who will tell you that there's nothing wrong with having a certain percentage of your portfolio invested in gold. I think 5 to 10% as a maximum is the number that usually gets bandied around, and that makes a certain amount of sense to me. It is certainly a store of value. There's no question about that. So if you're afraid that your other assets might depreciate, I mean a stock in a company, for example, can go to zero if the company goes out of business. Real estate can become worthless or close to worthless depending on the circumstances. Gold's never going to go to zero. You're always going to be able to do something with it, but it doesn't follow from that you can necessarily make any more money with it than you can with any other class of investment. You have to do these things wisely. A lot will depend on timing. What the price is when you buy it versus what the price is when you sell it, just like anything else. And I will add to that the gold buying universe is filled with scams. So many different types of scams. And you have to be very, very wary of what you're doing and really...
If you don't see somebody you recognize from 30 years ago on television, don't.
Yeah, I mean, there's an open question as to whether one needs to really own physical gold. There are other things you can do. You can buy stocks in gold mining companies. You can get ETFs now that will allow you to
much
get
safer.
in and out, but that are tied to the gold market. If you're gonna buy coins, I would buy the government coins at whatever value makes sense for you as an investor.
Getting back to your point, though, about the internationalization of currencies, when we're going now to cryptocurrency, and we're still hearing some of these rumblings about going back to a gold standard, does that have anything, congruous about it, these conversations?
Yeah, it's such an interesting area because on the one hand, you would think that gold, here's gold, which has this thousands and thousands of years of cultural history, and you have to dig it out of the ground. It's a physical thing that you can hold in your hand. Is the complete opposite of Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, right? Which is really a mathematical abstraction. It doesn't even exist in the physical world. At the same time, I feel like at least some of the energy behind the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency market is propelled by people who may also have an interest in gold. I mean, these are people who mistrust the central banking system or the system of paper currency that we have. They're both gold and Bitcoin derive their value from a certain amount of scarcity. There's only so many Bitcoins in the world that will ever be mined, and that's one of the sources of their value. And so I do think that they are kind of connected, if maybe only on a psychological level, more than a monetary level. And I've seen some proposals, and there are some startup companies out there who talk about using the blockchain technology that Bitcoin uses in order to create some kind of digital gold or gold certificates. It's all very interesting. I don't think it's going to change the world anytime soon, but it's fascinating to watch.
Oh, absolutely. And this is a fascinating topic. And folks, I would really encourage you to read the book, One Nation Under Gold, How One Precious Metal Has Dominated the American Imagination for 4 Centuries. There are some incredible historical tidbits about nuclear power and what that might have been involved with in terms of gold extraction. And then, of course, you've got some wonderful stories about the types of coin and currency that was used way back when. It really is a wonderful romp. It really is. I want to thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. James Ledbetter, congratulations, and thank you for being with us today on America Trends Podcast.
I enjoyed it.
If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share
No
our lists.
spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Even
Nobody's
if they
asked
asked
us.
us.
But.
Right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to
gonna
check
give you
it
a
out
quiz.
now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us @Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
certain- What's that?
Let
They're
us
not going to
out.
let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.